Hello, this is Kelsey, and this is the last day before the final of the 2015 World Championship. I promised I'd make a video for every single day of the group stage, and I failed to make a fourth video because I got sick. So I made a video about the IEM team choices for San Jose, I made a video about LGD, I made a video about Invictus Gaming, but I didn't make one yet about Edward Gaming. And since the tournament's kind of dying down, I can go a little bit wider breadth and talk about a misconception that I hear people bringing up a lot, which is that miscommunication in games due to language barrier is something that really caused the Chinese teams to fail. I don't think an inability to communicate in game was necessarily the problem, because I think that due to language barrier, obviously I think they weren't communicating. The team said they were having trouble communicating, but they said it wasn't due to the fact that it was Korean and Chinese. And if you listen to some of their comms from MSI, some of their comms from earlier in the season when I think the team was still on the same page, you can hear there's a crispness of the communication in terms of I have TP, okay, go, like they're talking. Towards the end, there's a lot less of that. They just stopped talking, in part because they were constantly rotating out players. They lost a lot of the chemistry over time. This is just a personal theory, but it felt like that happened to me, where they weren't really necessarily on the same page. Hurt their communication a little bit more than the language barrier itself. Where I do think the language barrier comes into play, because I think it actually really does, is when you're preparing strategically as a team. Aaron has made the famous joke, if your team has communication issues, they're less likely to argue with each other. But a lot of those arguments can be valuable, especially when you're talking about, for example, how to adapt to a brand new patch, brand new environment. You can use a translator to have these team discussions, but I feel like it's going to be a longer process of making sure everyone is on the same page, where you're constantly translating thoughts. You can't have free-flowing conversations about, I want to play this champion, I think this strategy is good, I think we should use this in the early game, move to this part of the map here. All these other aspects, I think, is just going to be a little bit slower. There's going to be more lost in translation, when you have a multiple language team, rather than being able to have an open conversation about these ideas. So, as a result of that, I think the Chinese teams, especially Invictus Gaming and EDG, because I think LGD did have some grasp of strategy prior to the World Championship, which they just didn't bring over. For example, they had the double TP thing down. They were able to understand minions and moving quickly between lanes and making those transitions, etc. And they lane swapped a lot, but they just didn't bring any of that to Worlds at all. But this isn't about LGD, this is about Edward Gaming, and I think that Edward Gaming and Invictus Gaming had a tendency to rely more on their stronger players trying to carry in the different positions, and just overpowering them. When I talked to people at MSI, they said they thought that position for position, Edward Gaming on average had better players. Obviously, you aren't necessarily going to say Pawn is better than Faker, all these issues, but just looking at position for position down the line, Edward Gaming has more advantages. So they don't necessarily need to know strategy as well as SK Telecom, and SK Telecom had better strategies overall. And this is something that I heard from Chinese casters, from English-speaking casters, all these other aspects. So I think they relied on that too heavily, instead of understanding how to develop strategies, how to change their approach, all these other things. So when they felt like they had to, when they felt like they were under pressure and the patch suddenly changed, they didn't have necessarily the roots to have that ability. I think Edward Gaming still have very, very strong infrastructure. They have a good coach, they have a good system, they have a Korean support who plays with Def, who translates information to Mako to explain, like, this is what Def feels and Def wants at this moment. They have really, really good regiment. Everyone, a wide staff, lots of health stuff, lots of other aspects. They of course had a lot of health issues this year, but they had an in-house doctor, all these elements. They have analysts, they have coaches. So I think that EDG has a good infrastructure. They just weren't focusing on the right things, which happens. You can have good infrastructure and just still need to learn these lessons. When the patch changed suddenly, they had to adapt their style very, very suddenly also, or they felt that they did. The dilemma that came is, if I have a team that isn't top-centric, do I suddenly try to play a top-centric style, understanding the issues with adapting a new strategy, putting gold on maybe the player that hasn't been my star player all year and relying on him to carry. Which top laner do I want run if I have multiple tops? How does my jungle adapt to changes in pathing? All of these aspects that you have to change. SK Telecom, Ku, Fnatic, all naturally I think did well because the patch swung into their favor in part, right? I think some of these teams would have done well regardless, but I think that the patch swung into this style that they were already playing, which was jungle camps top, jungle gets top ahead. Of course, Ku doesn't necessarily have the best jungle, but they have the top lane Reliance. They understand how to play around the top laner as a team, even if they do it later in the game. Whereas I think teams like Edward Gaming, Origin didn't. The difference between what Origin did and what Edward Gaming did is that Origin, throughout the tournament, they stuck to their bot-centered style. Some games it backfires. Some games, without jungle pressure, had to deal with the enemy jungler and the enemy top laner and went 0-9-3. You know, that happened to him. Whereas I think Edward Gaming, after losing to SK Telecom's playing stylistically, they went too far in the other direction and they tried to make it all about a top laner, and they switched their top laner out. So they're in a situation where they're not used to playing with this top for a while, and now they're suddenly playing around this top laner when core strength has always been okay. If the top laner comes top, I know how to avoid ganks. I know how to play without my jungler. I know all these things, and suddenly it looked like I didn't have access to comms. They were saying, okay, stay lane, I'll come down, we'll do the 2v2, so Korra would just die because the jungle would get there faster. Clearlove, whose pathing wasn't really as on par in this strategy, came slow, and then they both just died. I mean, that's effectively what happened multiple times throughout the series. If you watch the Fnatic versus Edward Gaming series, I talked to Reckless, and Reckless said they tried to play our style, and we're better at our style, which I agree. And I think Edward Gaming isn't necessarily going to do well at a top-centric style when they've spent all year playing around their bottom lane. And we've seen instances where Amazing J is much more reliant on top lane pressure, so that's part of why from the jungler, which is part of why he struggled, I think, in the group stage. And instead of trying to make Amazing J with the topside jungle pressure and trying to get the bottom to be more self-sufficient, they put in Koro, whose strength is playing without the jungler, and they also tried to get the style to play around him, which I don't think he'd necessarily be bad at if Edward Gaming were accustomed to. I don't know, because he had some decent early games, some decent ability to play some of these champions. It's just that the team cohesion in general seemed really, really off. And they tried to play these styles, for example, the Jace teleport strategy, which should have won them the game. Like, as weird and bizarre it is after you had the Gragas cast, Def should have been able to use the teleport and gone bottom and won the game. It should have won them the game, but it was clear they weren't comfortable with it. So if you're playing something you're not comfortable with or you don't really understand, you shouldn't be playing it. Which is why I think the switching to top hurt them significantly more than necessarily just the communication. But I think that was exacerbated by their inability to learn the new styles and to communicate effectively on how to execute these styles outside of the game. That's where I think the language barrier is going to come into to play more than in game. Of course, I haven't necessarily been on a team, but this is just my thought on it. So the one thing that doesn't really fit into what I talked about at all is Pawn. I think most people were talking about how Pawn just underperformed. I think the fact that they're used to playing around bot and they tried to play around top puts a lot more pressure on Pawn, because we've seen in the past that Def struggles in lane if he doesn't have jungle pressure. So Pawn could have filled that gap. However, he failed to do so. I mean, in scrims, people said Pawn was underperforming. He just wasn't playing well, and I think to an extent we had this a lot, and I think that could have been affected by the fact that you're switching out players all the time. SK Telecom switched out a lot of players on spring, switched out players significantly less in summer. I think they became much stronger, more cohesive unit because they weren't constantly swapping jungle mid. I don't know if that's why Koma stopped doing it as much or not. Maybe Faker just really performed better the way he said. I have no idea. But I think Edward Gaming went the opposite route, partly because of health issues, partly because they wanted to level up newer talent, and it backfired, made them a weaker team overall. Just really comes down to, though, I think Edward Gaming didn't understand their strengths, and they struggled to learn the new patch on top of that, and that's where they faltered.